la vérité touche au réel.
Young Jacquians have assembled. We have a very special guest. We have a special guest with us. Brian Becker, Dr. Todd McGowan himself, the inimitable Russell Spriglia, Isabel Millar.
Engaging the unconscious.
In the imaginary domain, we have an intersubjective dialectic.
Vanishing mediators.
All right, I'm recording. Wait, is it?
It's recording.
Okay.
What is going on, everybody? It is the Vanishing Mediators, the Void Boys, your co-host, the Big Sig, and Free Beer Tomorrow, also known as Hilarious Bookbinder. No, but we are back at it again with the finale, the second half, which isn't actually a progressive continuation, but it's a reworking through of the first one. Because what is at work but a repetition compulsion and insistence? This is the death drive. This is the entire seminar that Lacan has been insisting upon us to get at, to not focus on the ego. And in this section, we're going to cover the last part of the final section and give a review of just the entire seminar itself. So, Nick, what are we going over in this section? What's the name of this section right here?
Section that I was thinking we would go over in particular, because we covered everything else except for the tedious exchange that he has with Mr. X, Professor. That guy is about verbum versus da, which I think is Hebrew, right?
Right. Yeah, and it has to deal with, because Lacan is trying to talk about the difference between language and speech in this one, and compare it to the beginning of language and speech, and how you see it in Genesis. I guess there's this debate about in the beginning there was nothing, and then God spoke, said, "Let there be light." And but according to the argument, it's like, well, that's not necessarily language, because language has to deal with the signification, and it's that of naming things, if I'm not mistaken, is like really what the whole trajectory of it is. And he's like asking for Father Bernays' assistance on this, but at the same time, he doesn't want to get caught up in like this sort of like hermeneutics of the Bible. He's trying to like use a sort of like analogy of understanding like the creation story of the logos, and then also with speech and signification, which we should also really not just call it language, but signification, just like we kind of talked about in the end of the first seminar with the De Magistro, dialogue of St. Augustine and his son, in which he wants to talk about language and signification, and how what makes a master and what makes a student requires learning, and learning is also naming things. All words pretty much are nouns, right? That's the whole premise that Augustine gets at with the heart of language. Obviously, he wants to go into a more mystical side and talk about the word of God and something more transcendental, more Platonic. But Lacan is trying to focus on like the heart of language as like this sort of system of, maybe we could call it relations, but he'll talk about zeros and ones in like a cybernetic sense, and that there is this modulation of speech on the level of a sort of machine, a thinking machine, a sort of computation machine, any type of machine. It's just a term that he's using to show that, well, these modulations aren't language, but there is something as far as a message that's receiving back and forth. And language is something different. It's not in the level of the organic. It's almost like a virtual thing, but we shouldn't see it as this like transcendental container that contains everything, all these signs or zeros and ones, as he'll refer to binary code. It's rather something different. I don't know what you have to add to that.
Right. Well, I think the confusion between him and Father Bernard rests on this attempt to differentiate language from speech. And to be honest, no, actually, it's between him and Mr. X. I think that Lacan at this stage is ambiguous as to what makes one different from the other.
Right.
Because I feel like what we're dealing with is the speech act.
Mhm.
And it has something to do with where the subject recognizes himself in this modulation that
Yeah.
you're talking about of ones and zeros,
Right.
and the meaning that the subject extrapolates from that, which could only be a meaning that in some sense reflects back on the subject's being or non-being.
Right. Right.
But as Lacan points out later, he says this little corner of non-being wherein we are located isn't something we choose necessarily, which is interesting because later, and I don't want to misconstrue what he says, but I'm pretty sure it's something to the effect of it not being a choice, hence what will later be the forced choice.
Yeah, I
But
agree. Yeah.
I think this sort of spontaneous eruption of the subject within this binary system is what makes the binary system a non-all.
Yeah.
It can't be completed. It can't be self-contained. And, he talks a little bit about symmetry and asymmetry. And, mathematics is supposed to be this sort of safe haven where, especially with geometry, of course, which is the science of symmetry, where we find the symmetrical.
Yeah.
And from the time of, the birth of Athenian knowledge and measuring of things, although maybe some could say it goes back to ancient Egypt, there is this equation of meaning with a kind of symmetry. And
Right.
it's hard to not be tempted to believe that that the mechanical process of this unfolding of ones and zeros, that when these ones and zeros are grouped together, stacked on top of each other, and form secondary to it, but it's only, the meaning we ascribe to it as a whole, where it doesn't form a whole. Yes, these ones and zeros, when grouped in this way, necessarily this case is where the entire aha gain this kind of epiphanic meaning. But this is what I'm taking from it. I feel like this entire time I am missing something despite that. But what we were talking about before is that this whole recreational mathematics, we probably shouldn't see it as, oh, this is the language of the unconscious itself. This is what always operative behind, so much as the idea being the reconstruction in analysis. We have to remember that, and I was talking to you about this yesterday, I was talking to Mikey about this, the reconstruction of the unconscious in analysis is different from what we call the unconscious as it appears
Right.
suddenly
Yeah.
in this eruptive sense. The reconstruction of it is the reconstruction of what's repressed, the return of the repressed. And then we get this sense that, oh, okay, other unfolding while I was living my conscious life. As I the unconscious in this sort of momentary eruption.
Right. And I think it's like, this is what he kind of wants to get at. Cause like, I really like when you brought up the whole point of geometry, which when they're talking about triangles, I think it's, forget who it is that says something about like, even when we talk about triangles, it's not something that like is like a given thing on its own. It's still a set of relations, but these relations have a sort of have a symmetry to them. And looking at like, the emphasis of geometry and formal logic in the heart of continental philosophy, truth has a nature of symmetry that's trying to be sought for, like got at, and especially with the Greeks, this has to deal with harmony and things and totality. And we know, like, as far as not only Lacan, but later Lacanian thinkers, neo-Hegelians, Lacanians like Zizek are always talking about, totality or an absolute is always fragile or split, and that it fails, but there's always this reworking, and we see a reworking of the subject reconstituting its history, its truth, through this repetition. And so this is maybe where you could probably get into talking about going from geometry to his little diagram that he talks about, which is like, I wouldn't call it diagram, more of like these math themes of capital A, lowercase m, lowercase a, and then capital S. So like capital A being the math theme for the big other, and then you have M, which is supposed to be the ego, and then A is a little other, but the little a is little other, and then S being the subject. And so he says something about like, well, we got to look at how language, the symbolic order, and the imaginary, right? Well, there is this tension. It's because there is this narcissistic libidinal relationship of the ego with the imaginary dynamic, the little other, right? It wants, well, it's part of the pleasure principle. This is what Freud points out. It wants to aim at satisfaction because that's what libido aims at, and sort of does so out of a misrecognizing what is going on. Just like in these games that we talk about of odds and evens, purloined letter, the prisoner's dilemma of not only hesitation, but also a misrecognition of what is going on. And this keeps the dynamic of hidden of the symbolic order and language in connection with the subject that is being misrecognized in this libidinal relationship with the machine of the subject's relation to the big other, which is capital A. And this is where we get repetition compulsion, because language acts as a network of combinations that repeat the message and retroactively go back to account for itself in that message, which is the subject retroactively doing so. And the insistence or the death drive, which he says at the end of this chapter, is, well, the insistence of the symbolic order insofar as it's dumb. It's a dumb machine, right? Yeah. And the ego doesn't recognize that because it is caught in this narcissistic relation. Now, right. What I'm trying to get at, what this has to deal with is that, well, the language, the symbolic order, is not something that is natural in the way that we prior linguists like to think of, just like like mathematicians and geometry bros like to think that, oh, these shapes, these symmetrical angles or whatever, these forms are all experienced in nature, in what Lacan calls the imaginary dimension of nature, and what Gestalt appropriates as the good form. And we could see language operating there. He's like, no, language is actually this sort of artificial thing. And really, Death Drive is the process of this artificiality, because, well, pretty much it's bound to error, but it's artificial because of the fact that it has no relation to a sort of organic totality, right? It is something that kind of takes a life of its own, but it's like not something that is like wholly deterministic, right? It's not something transcendental.
Well, so he says that apropos of these series and these patterns, this machine, that, no, I'm sorry, he's talking about chance.
Yeah,
Chance is neither law nor intention.
exactly. Yeah.
And if you think about it, it's hard to conceive of anything that's neither law nor intention.
Right.
It seems like it's one or the other. So the whole point of mapping or tracing all of these alternations of presence and absence, the patterns that they generate, the complexity of those patterns, it's not, it seems to me it's like not so much to demonstrate that language functions that way, and that by understanding, by cracking the code,
Right.
we will obtain anything in the process, so much as, well, the scene is set for chance as that which is neither intention nor law. But here's the thing, is that it seems like whatever initiated the entire process to begin with itself was a moment of pure chance.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I think. It's misleading to focus too much on how these different hierarchies of embedded binaries function and create a more elaborate sort of recording system. It's misleading to focus on that, whereas like the entire general thrust of this like machinic unfolding is itself commences with a kind of chance gesture,
right.
contingent gesture. Now, this is what I'm spitballing here. This is what I'm trying to make of it, because I'm trying to. It's almost like resist this temptation to view what he's saying as the truth of drive in the mathematics itself.
Yeah.
It's, like you said, the stupidity of it, the fact that it's a dumb machine, is exactly what I think he wants us to actually focus on.
Right. Which is not to get into like some like machinic unconscious thing in which we're constantly assembling onto new things and creating.
And just to say one more thing, it's kind of like what he says in the final chapter is that this idea of chance, which is I remember, in Italian they use the French word. Chance is a French word, and they say chance. It's like as if it's almost like a French concept.
Yeah.
There's not a real equivalent, at least in Italian, for that word chance. Chance is like a unique concept, and I would like a French speaker to explain exactly all of the connotations of it. But he says that through free association itself and the psychoanalytic process that ensues from that starting point is meant to bring forth a moment of actual chance and contingency, right?
Mhm.
Which is like And I would say chance and contingency are pretty much, and some people might disagree, but without being too pedantic, it's like kind of synonymous.
Yeah.
The contingency, it's supposed to bring forth a kind of contingency.
Right.
And one thing that I'm realizing, I just want to add before I finish up, is one thing I'm realizing is that, and this is one of the issues that I have with anyone who, we both love philosophy. I'm inclined towards philosophy even more so than analysis, because you want to be an analyst. I don't have any aspiration to be an analyst, but I want to understand psychoanalysis as it understands itself, not necessarily in its immediate philosophical valence. And I think one thing that I'm starting to realize is that everything that we construct as psychoanalytic concepts in the process, we can't say that any of these concepts exists out there in any ontological sphere. They're not ontologized, and that what we reconstruct is the unconscious. What we reconstruct is the return of the repressed. What we reconstruct is the meaning of the symptom. And
Right.
he uses signifier and signified, I think, for one of the first times here when he's talking about, it's an adumbration of what he's going to talk about later on, but he talks about signifier and signified here in the context of the symptom, and that it's a content, it condenses signified and signifier. It's only through the reconstruction that any of these concepts have any real meaning, but we can't ontologize them. And that's the issue. This is what I was saying before about the unconscious. When Bruce Fink, in his essay, characterizes recreational mathematics as the language of the unconscious, he's not trying to say that this is like the HTML of subjectivity. No, that's not how it works. All of this entire elaborate assemblage, to use the word used before, that Lacan and Fink and all Lacanians are setting up, is not to say, look, this is what the world is, this is what's real, this is how you should approach the world in terms of its true meaning, but saying that this elaborate assemblage is what you reconstruct theoretically in the process of analyzing someone.
Right, because we're reconstructing it through the speech act, but all, like, language is happening on a discourse between the subject and the other, and so far as like these temporal moments of the return of the repressed come about, something that happens by an insistence in a chance if the conditions are there, which happens, and again, to go back to logical time, this, so far as there's a time for comprehending, right, of comprehending oneself and anticipating one's history, and it requires that there be an other, right? And he talks about in this chapter of when we talk about the analyst as other, he has to be the big represent the position of the big other, and so far he's aloof. He uses some weird, I guess, German play on word term, but it's like aloof, but also mirror or some shit like that. But what he's trying to get is like, because the libidinal investment of the ego, which again, I really like what you're talking about we're not trying to ontologize stuff, because there's a tendency to ontologize the subjectivity that's being talked about in here, which is what makes Lacan, in a sense, an anti-philosopher. But there's still a philosophical kernel to Lacan. We're just not doing ontology of the mind, right? And that this ego is always a formulation. Freud talks about this through a libidinal investment, which is also a refining of the object. This is the whole thing about libido and sexuality, but it's a misrecognized object that requires the other, right? Of course, the big other is the instantiation of language, the effective language, but the little other, insofar as it could relate to the ego and give the ego the alter ego, right? And have the sort of mere lure of investment. As he'll say in the beginning of the early chapters, I think it's on the materialist definition of the phenomenon of consciousness as like a fascinare, like a fascination that allows for this libidinal investment, which we could see is where symptoms, formulate within the speech act themselves, but also he points out resistances. But we know that it's like these resistances, like for instance, silence or other things that could impede the transference, are of course on the ego resisting what he would call in these early seminars full speech, but resistance is always on the level of the analyst, and it's so far as they're interpreting the resistance that comes about from the way they position themselves in the transference, right? So what I'm trying to get at is that it's in these conditions that a subject arises, not something that is always there. The ego is not a static thing. It's not a cogito. And it's not like this thing that's always in a relation with an object, like an object relationist analyst, or something that is sort of what Lacan would call, it's like, what ego are we talking about? Well, this ego that object relations, ego psychology is really positing is not the ego of the analysand, right? It's ultimately a fetishization of the analyst ego that they want to instantiate as, oh, this is something that is, autonomous. This is something that is a given, or at least like this is what's being splitting, and we have to reconstitute resilience in your ego. It's like, no, the ego is a misrecognition, and it's constantly being misrecognized through the other, little other. But on the level of the big other, right, and the relation to the subject, this is a discourse that's going on. The subject of the unconscious that manifests itself in the discourse of the big other, in these parapraxis, in these moments that only by a certain chance could come about, which is not located in an organic level, in an imaginary level, right? It is not localizable. This is why he uses these schemas, but at the same time, he doesn't want to give a fixed reference of where the subject is. This is why he got on Leclerc about, being an idolater, because he creates these topographies that show where the subject is. The subject is nowhere, right? It's non-localizable, but it arises out of a chance, out of a almost conditions of possibility, but it can never formulate itself because it's like almost like a condition of impossibility, which is where we get death drive, right? Your mic's off.
Yeah, and no, there was a lot to go off of there. Yeah. The condition of possibility is the condition of impossibility, and there are a lot of directions that we could take that in. We don't have a concept of the name of the Father yet. He hasn't really brought prohibition into the picture at this point.
The prohibition of incest does come up insofar as we talk about the symbolic order, but like that's something that could only happen by, creating this sort of combination factor of like what he talks about with Levi-Strauss. Like we get the combinations of alliances and stuff like that. And so to create like an instantiation, it relies on like rules and regulations and prohibitions. But right. Yeah, I get what you're saying. It's not articulated in like the name of the Father.
Well, I kind of like this though, because before we get all the, the juiciest Lacanian concepts that actually have got more Freudian resonance, what's interesting about these two seminars is they're the return to Freud, but he talks very little of the Freudian mythos,
right,
that we've talked about before. And obviously the lectures that stand out are the Purloined Letter lecture, the coin toss lecture that precedes that, and all of his comments on cybernetics. Now, what's interesting about it is that we get almost something like an elaboration of the original or originary signifier or attempt to signify in Fort Da.
Yeah.
This alternation of presence and absence. And what does this seminar rely on heavily? What does it attribute to, if not beyond the pleasure principle, which he mentions again and again. So I think this entire seminar should be read in the light of that. He says in this lecture, you should be carrying this book around with you in your pocket. I'm sure maybe in France they had the pocket versions of that book. But no, that's all to say, it's kind of like with the recreational mathematics, I keep going back to it because I think it's a really important kind of way station between this phase of Lacan's work where he's getting out of the imaginary into the symbolic. Lacan of the imaginary is the Lacan that was writing before the seminars. He's Lacan of the symbolic here, and he's grappling with the real, as we know. But his attempts to resolve these questions, which I think are failures ultimately, and I do think that at the end of the day, in this seminar, there is an ambiguity that he hasn't accounted for because he doesn't have the most developed sense of the real. But we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater here, because his conception of the coin tosses, the way he conceptualizes it, I think is really important because it's stripped of this mythos, right? It is almost a kind of logos pared down to its most essential, and it does say something about the differential network that we're dealing with here, the differential network that remains operative, I would say, throughout his work. But I think the point is that at the very basic level, the symbol is that which can make itself absent, and it is the absence of the symbol which strangely invokes its presence, and then later we might say that fantasy fills that in. He doesn't give us any recourse to the concepts that we are used to dealing with when we're thinking about Lacan at this point, even though I think some of them, many of them, he might have, in the holster. But that's all to say, and I think I'm going way far afield of what you're talking about. This whole cybernetic thing, you really do get a view of what the real is and what the subject is for Lacan in the way that it's trying to situate the subject within the alternation of ones and zeros is an impossibility. It seems irrelevant. It seems as if I'm not any closer to understanding this concept of the subject, but you yourself being in the position of Lacan's auditor, trying to work through these impossible formulae like we were with the prisoner's dilemma, where no matter how close you feel like you get to the meaning of it, you're still stuck. You're in the position of the subject there. The ego, as we know, but this seminar is also about the ego, right? So the ego, as we know, becomes this kind of defense formation, almost as if to fill in the void left by the impossibility of the subject, I would say. And that the entire kind of layering process of the construction of the ego makes me very sorry for humankind, because it's sort of that to be an object in the world among other objects, and also to be in some sense doomed to remain the horizon of all subjectivity, because the subject is the subject, because our subjectivities we see as omnipotent in some sense, and be the object at the same time, means that we're always in this very precarious state of dealing with the fragility of the identifications that we form in order to constitute something like our design, our being in the world as one of many objects. And that what psychoanalysis does is intervene on that level to interrogate the reasoning. And when I say reasoning, I don't mean the kind of reasoning we deal with in everyday life, but the nonsensical sort of recreational, let's say, reasoning that went into this metonymic form of constructing the ego. And I think that's what he wants us to get at, because this isn't called, the name of the seminar is not the subject.
No.
In Freud's papers. I always forget the name of the seminar, to be honest.
It's the ego in Freud's theory and in technique of psychoanalysis.
Right. It's not the subject in Freud's theory and technique, it's the ego in Freud's theory and technique. And we've been saying it, we've been banging this hammer from the start. You've done great at like trying to convey this to our listeners, that the ego is not the subject, and the ego, which is itself a misrecognition, has been misrecognized up until this point by the analysts of his time, by his peers. It's a misrecognition of a misrecognition. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, what's the saying? It's like, I forget the German thing, but where it was, ego will be. Pretty much of like, the ego is always where the subject was. And I think, what's fascinating, and I want to evoke what Chiesa has to say, or Lorenzo Chiesa, in his Subjectivity and Otherness, about when earlier Lacan, like, we could see subjectivization, I think it is. But ultimately, what the subject is trying to do is subjectivize lack. We're subjectivizing our lack. And the subject is not the ego. The ego is not the subject. But there is a relation that the subject has to the ego insofar as it is caught in a misrecognition, caught in this narcissistic investment, libido, cathexing into this economy, right? And he doesn't have his theory of language yet in these early seminars that we'll see, talking about signifiers, S1, master signifier. We don't have the instance of the barred subject. We don't have, the chain of signification. But when he does these games, like odds and evens, when he talks about cybernetics, the combinatory factor, what we still get, though, is we see how the real comes about through the process of signification, because he wants to get at the fact that there wasn't something prior to the symbolic order, like we would think, like this, like pure reality, like this pure transcendental fixed mode of being of the subject, right? And however, in some instances in these early seminars, he will say that the real is like reality itself. But when he gets into talking about these games that represent ways the symbolic order function, we get the real as the sort of contradiction that arises out. But when we get into Lacan of semiotics, Jacobson and Saussure, we then get how the relationship between the real and language are these gaps that lack meaning, and it's only retroactively that we constantly go back to speak on a matter that the real emerges from the return of the repressed, right? Because this allows him to talk about, when we talk about neurosis, that, well, and again, we mentioned, you mentioned about the whole thing that the name of the father isn't there, but what does the name of the father do insofar as it instantiates the signifier via the prohibition, is that we get substitution, a substitution of different signifiers, right? A substitution from the point in which the subject was both affirmed from this point of chance and also negated. This is the whole point about the imprinting, the pragung of the traumatic moment. And Fort Da, something interesting that McCormick says that in sort of the middle period of Lacan, where he's kind of elaborating his work on his symbolic order and desire, that for Da, what is being kind of worked through is the mastery of the sign, the loss of the signifier. But in later Lacan of Seminar 11, it's the object cause of desire. And we see how the real changes the more that he elaborates to symbolic order from these games, from talking about structural anthropology to talking about signification.
Right. And at the end of this seminar, he says two things. One, which I think he maybe carries with him until the end of his career, and something that I think he would absolutely abandon. What he's calling the death instinct at this point, he says, is a mask of the symbolic order.
Right.
I don't think by Seminar 7 he would say that. But then he also says that there is an insistence to be on the part of the signifier, right? Well, he doesn't call it the signifier, but the symbolic. And that even if he wouldn't say the symbolic is that insistence to be of what does not exist, that has non-being, like what you were saying yesterday with the unconscious, there's always in Lacan something, and ultimately it becomes death drive, which is a non-being which insists on being. And this insistence to be is, in some sense, the motor of human subjectivity.
Yeah.
And that it's like, and that's the hard thing. And this is what can be lost in a superficial reading of Lacan and these concepts, especially if we're going to be little idolaters, right?
Yeah.
And idolize all of the different layers that seem to exist here, creating a kind of medieval taxonomic hierarchy, like a Linnaeus sort of like hierarchy of everything in existence. No, that's not what he's getting at. We have to begin to think non-being with being, and that the twist, the torsion, Mobius strip, everything that Lacan's always at pains to illustrate by means of these topologies has to do with something that is not, like you said, this lack attempting to subjectivize itself. Why does Lacan's system lend itself to Hegel and theories of history? And like, why, unlike, I don't know, Winnicott or Piaget, can his system be, in some sense, expanded to embrace other interdisciplinary or really extremely lofty questions in general? Well, it's because no one is dealing with this dialectic of being and non-being, and the idea of what is not within the machine, what the machine cannot account for, as we always talk about. The machine cannot account for its own totality as a machine.
Right.
And I would like to talk to someone who is an engineer. You're an electrician. Maybe you could find some examples of this, but anyone who works with machines or technology in any way might actually find some kind of resonance here, in that it's like, well, the machine taken as a whole also needs to be inscribed into its functionality, but can't be, because there is no such thing as taking it. It's impossible to take into account the machine as a whole. Now Derrida might have thought that he surpassed Hegel by coming to a similar revelation, and other deconstructivists. But the important thing here is that what Hegel's saying, and not to take us too far afield, but I think what Lacan might be saying without realizing it is that, yes, that last moment of the impossibility of the machine to account for itself, its own failure, is actually, keep using this phrase, would love to find some synonyms for it, but the condition of possibility for that machine
Yeah.
to be. And that's the hardest thing to get your mind wrapped around, but that's the ultimate essence of this Lacanian torsion that we see in the system, even at this level. It's something that he's not going to lose. That's the real, and you can only see the real in these moments. Why does Zizek use examples? Just to impress us? Maybe partially, but also because it's like you can only really appreciate the real in these examples, because the real only appears in a material form, but in the impossibility of matter to be what it is,
Right.
to encompass itself. This is what Lacan already at this stage seems to understand very well, even if he doesn't have his entire repertoire of tools and ideas handy. It's this idea that right here, but he's attributing it to Freud. The system cannot be a proper system because it can't understand its own systematicity, what makes it a system. This is what gets things going. This is what throws into motion the entire chain that leads to everything. It's like, but just to take it back to subjectivity, because I feel like I'm rambling here, it's like this idea of subjectivized lack, it still suggests that there's like a kind of tangible corporeal lack that needs something to encircle it, that needs something. But again, it leads us back to this loop of only after the fact does it appear as such. I don't know if that means anything. I'm sorry to
like, because
yeah, go ahead.
No, just because like the fact is like, well, I mean, Zizek, he elaborates more on like the three registers, but like we could see is like for the real in Lacan, it's almost as if he's playing on what Zizek would say. Well, he says this in two spots. He says this on the forward to the second edition of For They Know Not What to Do. And then he says it in his lecture on the reality of the virtual, of like you have the imaginary real, the symbolic real, and the real real. And like I feel like right here we get, in a sense, certain aspects of the real, just not that matured. But the symbolic real is like we'll talk about. He says right here. I'm gonna read the quote from Zizek. So there are three modalities of the real. You have the real, the horrifying thing, the primordial object from Irma's throat to the alien. You have the symbolic real, the real as consistency, the signifier reduced to a senseless formula, like quantum physics, formulas which can no longer be translated back into or related to the everyday experience of our life. And the imaginary real, the mysterious je ne sais quoi, the unfathomable something on account of which the sublime dimension shines through an ordinary object. The real is thus, in effect, all three dimensions at the same time, the abyssal vortex which ruins every consistent structure, the mathematized, consistent structure of reality, the fragile pure appearance. I like the whole instance of like the symbolic real, because it's like, well, this is what he's showing with like all these math themes, and like the way he wants to kind of show, like, as you said, that mathematics isn't like this safe haven where it's like it's untouchable. It's just like something that's purely consistent, harmonious. It's like these represent apodactic truths of some sort, of intuitions, that can't be doubted, no matter what type of certain mathematics you're dealing with. It's just like, well, there are definitely formal structures, But when you try to apply them in to reality and then abstract them back, it's like they become more senseless, right? You have to reduce them down to something until it's like it pretty much can't work. It's a failure, right? And quantum physics is known for this in the way that it tries to not get at the heart of reality, but try to create a model of reality that could hold some consistency to what is trying to get the heart out. But the fact is that the model itself takes on a life of its own and inverts reality only to get at reality itself, which is already another inversion of the model, which inverted that thing that couldn't exist without the model. That was a lot. That was a mouthful, but I hope that makes sense. It's like,
No, that was really good. Yeah, wow. Okay.
and I think that's what he's trying to show with like the whole thing of like cybernetics, mathematics, binary codes, all these things. I think that's what is at least really brilliant. And of course, we get the real that sort of object in Irma's throat, because he does talk about, the Irma's injection dream, and he wants to show like, oh, like this is like where I could talk about the real right here, because it's something in which like Freud couldn't account for in himself. It's something that remained out of the heart of meaning, the gaps, right? Was this like formless body that could not be signified, right? And pretty much an encounter with the void, right?
No, what you said there, though, I had never thought about before. I feel like I had a kind of epiphany, and like all epiphanies, I feel like it'll probably be trivialized at some point. But no, what you said there, like, yeah, the mathematics itself, the binary, as this imaginary redoubling,
Yeah.
which Zizek tries to, and I feel like it's glossed over in For They Know Not What They Do. But how do we get from the imaginary to the symbolic? Everybody's in a rush to get the symbolic so that they can understand the real, only to turn the real into the thing in itself, which seems to me to be what so many, even hardcore Lacanians, fall prey to. Well, I like what you said there as sort of, if I understood you correctly, mathematics as this sort of imaginary redoubling of something that's already inverted, that actually leads to the symbol proper, that leads to the symbolic order proper, and that we don't, where is their content in the three registers? Nowhere. That's the interesting thing. The imaginary doesn't really give you content. All other, the symbolic doesn't, the real doesn't. It seems like all other philosophical systems, and what we're dealing with is not a philosophical system, at least for the most part, and I know that's a very blanket statement, they seem to contain this promise of like, well, the content, the stuff of reality comes from here. This is where we get it from. This is where we get our gross domestic product that becomes, that at least, let's say in the Kantian way, gets its categorical grid applied to it, and gets turned into like the hamburger meat of our everyday reality, the patties. With Lacan, you're like, well, where's the content? Because the real's not real. The real's not there. The symbolic, if you really think about it, is just this inversion of an inversion. And then the imaginary is the retroactive effect of that, which we think as our starting point, but actually is just the afterglow of the symbolic. Neither of them, or all three of them, not one can claim the place of primacy.
Yeah.
That's why this is why later in his career, Lacan he lamented the Borromean, his use of the Borromean knot, because he said it didn't quite capture what he wanted to say, because it suggested that one of these orders was, and it's impossible to not prioritize one of the orders.
Right.
Where they all have to be thought in conjunction as a trio. That's what object A was supposed to resolve in some sense.
Yeah.
But I think like what you said right there really gets at, okay, even before we get to the signifier signified, this is what I like about these seminars. We're not dealing, like I said, we're not in the typical expected wheelhouse of what Lacan is doing. We are actually doing, so what's the symbolic? What is the insistence of the symbol? Well, to recreational mathematics here, which is what I like to call it, I think it kind of captures everything, or the combinatory. It is that redoubling of reality that does have its kind of weird refractory permutations in different directions of just like branching out and splitting, and we could endlessly build and complexify all of these different groupings, and they would form a kind of memory system, and that's important too. But like you said, it's this redoubling of something that's already an inversion, which we get. Let's take it back to the optical schema, and I would like to hear what you have to say about this. In the optical schema, we get this redoubling of what's already inverted. In the optical schema, we have the ideal ego, which is already itself, well, misrecognition, right? It's already an attempt to master the image in the mirror, the imago.
Mm-hmm.
That's an inversion. We get a further inversion. What we don't get is any point in which beneficent reality intervenes to give us a kind of like meat to our reality. We get an inversion of an inversion, a redoubling, a reflection of a reflection. And that's the symbol.
Exactly, because and here's the thing. Yes, Lacan was stuck in the imaginary in the early seminars and some of the essays early on in that are published in the Accree, but not because he wants to, bring primacy to it, right? There is a real to the imaginary there. And so far to show that it's lacking content, that it fails because of this redoubling. Look at the whole point of the first introduction of the optical schema, in which it's like, well, what does the flower, the vase represent? Are we talking about the cauldron of instincts and libidinal drives before we get into like the genital stage? Like as if there's this sort of pre-inscribed thing as it was prior to being conditioned by norm or all this like society and stuff like that. As most of these analysts that are highly trained, whether they're Freudian revisionists, some sort of Kleinian or whatever doxa was going on back then, ego psychologists, that they think that there's some like kind of preordained whole baby that's going through individuation, or that there's this like sort of locus of animalistic primal urges that need to be conditioned by the Oedipus complex. He's like, no, like with this optical schema, right? The more you try to fetishize like what is behind the vase or behind the box, like inside, the more, you're missing the point. It's that it's meaningless. Like the whole point is that the optical schema relies on inverting of an image, because what we get is something that is completely lacking. It's not totalized, but once we get the inversion for the ideal ego, right, it's nothing but a form, right? Chiesa talks about how that the ego ideal is what gives form for the ideal ego. But at the same time, this form, right, it's not something that is like sequential or like chronological, but there is this sort of dialectic going on between the two. And in this optical schema, he shows how, well, the image fails ultimately. Because if we focus on the imaginary alone, right, there's a sort of anticipation that is needed, and it needs an other. It needs the plane mirror to reflect on to maintain consistency. And you can't reduce the image to something. There is a sort of real image that is lost, but something that maybe could be considered the imaginary real insofar that it's an unfathomable, or not unfathomable. What does he talk about? It's like a sort of sublimity or unfathomable object, maybe. The point I'm trying to make is that when Lacan is focusing on the imaginary in this optical schema, he shows that, well, even in phenomenology, we try to look at for good form. Someone like Merleau-Ponty, who is focused on perception in his early works, focus on a lot of Gestalt. And with good form of, which means totality of an image, we try to localize ourselves and localize the ego as an embodiment. And it's not an embodied holistic thing. It's a fragmented body. We have a failed image based upon an inversion, right? Because it is already, the image only matters insofar as it is inverted. This is where misrecognition happens. This totality is rather actually misrecognized by not realizing that it's fragmented. And then we need the plane mirror, which acts as, you could see, the other, so that now we have, I guess, the imaginary symbolic order. And so this is where he leaps into the symbolic order, but the imaginary on its own already fails because, well, we have frustration, right? Frustration is something that happens in the imaginary that is produced based upon the feeling of lack. Now, it's not like symbolic lack or real lack, but it's kind of like, I guess Lacan is trying to get something there, that there's this pressurized feeling, and Chiesa talks about this, of hanamorization or hanamoration or whatever it's called, of love hating. And that's because the feeling of that consistency of that image, which is already an inversion, is taken away from you, right? That investment. And that's what he wants to get at with this optical schema, to show that, well, what we're getting at, this ego is not whole, it's not localized, it can't be reduced down to a body part or a set of organs. It is a narcissistic relation, but it's a narcissistic relation is an investment because it is a lack. It's a lacking image, an inverted image, a misrecognized image that brings about alienation. You know, alienation needs an other, so the image is already an other.
My question is that then what is the ideal ego? Can we speak about the ideal ego as it is by itself, or as Chiesa really deftly shows, that the retroactivity that takes effect when we quote unquote arrive at the symbolic,
Right.
generates a conception of the ideal ego, but there's no moment of the ideal ego. It's almost as if our starting point is the ego ideal.
Yeah.
In a way, just as he says, and we're going to really dive into this book, because to me, I don't know why it's so neglected. I think it unlocks so much about Lacan, but he says one thing that we might not realize as Lacanians is that when it comes to the mother and her tending to the demands of the child, which do have to do with, of course, biological need, these acts of love, that she has a symbolic agency. And that quasi-symbolic agency, and let's not forget Forta, quasi-symbolic agency, she begins to establish the symbolic order. We tend to believe it happens in one fell stroke once the name of the father is introduced.
Mhm.
But it's much more complicated than that, because there is a proto-symbolic, and this is what Giza says in the mother's performance of her role here. There's a proto-symbolic function to it, but we can't really call it the symbol proper until prohibition
Right.
comes along. But what does the name of the father do but obviously drive a wedge between the child and the mother, but also name what the child's desire was the entire way through. And also it has to do with, I love that Jacques points this out, for they know not what they do. It's really the self-referentiality, the impossible self-referentiality of the mother's desire, meaning that because desire has only itself to reference, because there's no real outside to it in that sense, that is what becomes maddening for the child, and becomes maddening for all living humans for the rest of their lives, is the kind of self-referentiality of the mother's desire. But we see in Fort Da that this attempt at mastery, in some sense, is a first venture into trying to get beyond the modulations of maternal presence and absence in a way that would somehow get to a beyond, but also wants to keep that insistence of the modulation going at the same time. And this is what later Death Drive is going to capture in its movement. But that takes us way far afield of the original question, which was like, yeah, what is the ideal ego, and why does the ego ideal give a form to it?
Right. So like pretty much like Freud never really elaborated further on both ideal ego and ego ideal, but the ideal ego is an idealized image of oneself, but it can only be formulated and be an idealization insofar as the ego ideal determines it, right? Determines it through the other, as like, well, if you have the other to formulate your ego ideal, you're anticipating who you'll be in the future, because what will that mean for you, right? Not just for the other, but then you retroactively think that it'll bring you the sense of fulfillment, right? Fulfillment. And so again, to use the jargon, the ego ideal is pretty much the content that determines the form, and the form or formality of the ego is the idealization. But I mean, we shouldn't see these as like fixed. It's like the ego ideal, or the ideal ego, is like ultimately lacking. It's alienation, right? Because what we're dealing with is a narcissistic investment, and there's a seesaw desire between the two that fluctuate, because what is desire but the other's desire? The desire of the other. It could be of the mother, but the other of that has the jouissance. And if I know it, if I obtain it, I get a sense of mastery. That mastery is to have this feeling of maybe substantialness to myself, this feeling of a center, of being complete. And this is all in the imaginary relationship. This is where, like, when we talk about the paradigms of jouissance, the imaginary paradigm of jouissance is on this master-slave dialectic of rivalry, in which the ego is alienated by the other, and there is a symbolic mediation between that, a pact. And so the rivalry of one day having that jouissance, but also being afraid of getting too close to it, because that could equal a symbolic death. But it's still a sort of like imaginary sort of fixation onto the other. It does need a symbolic aspect to it, but that symbolic aspect allows for the position of ego ideal to be there, only to retroactively create an imaginary structure of what would be called ideal ego, right? As this primordial, like, this is who I was, this is who I was, or this is how I am, it's how I believe myself to be. But that needs language, that needs, meaning to give that. And with that meaning relies on signifiers, which relate to a symbolic order that gives you an ego ideal, a sort of sense of duty, a determination for the other, right? Like, you could see maybe that being a teacher and fulfilling that role, or like, whether it's like a son or daughter, or, certain job position, manager, worker, like, all these things are, in a sense, they're all semiotic positions, but there is an ego identification aspect to it, to identify with that role and fill in that role, whether you like it or not, but to sort of still carry it further because it'll determine yourself for the other, and also how you're supposed to be, right?
What's funny about that? You just made me think, with the professions that you named, when it comes to blue collar jobs, especially in America, where we don't have a history of class consciousness, so to speak, although obviously there's always been a strong leftist sort of throb in America, for sure, not to discount it, but in our own kind of individualistic society, there's always a kind of, like, on the one hand, if you have a working class job, like a vocation, if you're part of a union, let's say, you work with your hands, there's, like, simultaneously a kind of apology that people give for being in that position, while also, bolstering themselves at the same time. I know this sounds like so out there, but I was thinking about this when you're talking about this kind of semiotic position, as you put it. It's like, the plumber, the electrician,
Right.
the person who works with, the mechanics of something at that level,
Right.
and isn't necessarily relied upon for their ideas, their minds, their opinions, like, what would be considered PMC and up, or
Yeah.
it's always like, well, I'm a mere plumber, or a mere worker, but at the same time, I perform this valuable function for society. I serve my purpose. I think that it almost has an echo of castration,
Right.
in that this is the ego ideal, in a way, because it's like, I'm castrated in that I don't get to live a glamorous life. What I do, I don't get praised for it in the way I would like to.
Mhm.
I don't get to win an Academy Award for welding, but what I do is valuable.
Right.
To me, there's that's like kind of castration. That is like and that is in a sense what especially in American life is sort of celebrated. It's like romanticized, which actually prevents there from being a real anything like class consciousness, because it's like, yeah, you might come home from work battered, sooty, demoralized at the end of the day because you perform this function for society and you put things together. Like, you can rest assured that you're a good person, you're a better person than people who leech off the system.
Mhm.
Right? That's all to say, it's like the position that's occupied there has to do with like reveling in castration
Yeah.
in that way. Do you see what I'm kind of getting at? That
Yeah.
to me is like the ego ideal, and that is what with Lacan, what he's saying when he has that famous quote, which I don't know, but like, you have to renounce your jouissance to climb the ladder of
Mhm.
desire, essentially, in order to regain it, which is like, in a sense, you would have to really give up on ever obtaining the ideal ego to let what your drive is seeking be filtered through the avenues of
Right.
ego ideal
Yeah.
castration, which
Exactly.
is supposed to be a sign of maturity too, right? Isn't that a sign of maturity? Isn't that what we tell kids? Like, you can't get everything, you can't get what you want all the time. But kids do understand that, is the thing.
Yeah.
But here, and this is I know I'm like really like going all over the place, but I just want to make one more thing clear, because I think it's interesting, is that we think, oh, kids are really selfish. They don't understand that they can't have everything they want all the time. It's like, no, they do understand. When they don't get something they like, and it depends on the kid and how they're raised, of course, they're spoiled kids or whatever, but like, they do understand. They have but they follow a law of their own, whereas like, they often don't get what they want and accept it.
Yeah.
When they don't get something they really want in a certain moment, they do perceive it as an injustice of the magnitude of the injustices that we experience in everyday life. So it's like, all that's to say, as Alanka puts it, where do adults come from?
Mhm.
What we see as this level of maturity, which is an acceptance of castration, which we know that the richest and most powerful among us feel like, well, I don't have to fully accept castration, that's what makes me different, is not anything in particular. And the example that I was using is, of course, is not like to in any way denigrate or like take away from the work that working class people do, but more so the kind of romanticization of it that becomes a basis for actual, like an actual reinstantiation of the order as it is, because it's like you occupy your little like romanticized position of being like closer to almost like a noble savage in a way, and it's like, but with a kind of inherent genius that like we could never get at with all of our empty pontificating and airy sentiments. But the whole point is that to me kind of represents what the ego ideal is about, and why the ego ideal ultimately rests on castration.
Yes. Yeah. And language. And here's the thing, it's that, so to put it simply, ideal ego, of course, like I just reiterating, is determined, its form is determined by the ego ideal. But what the ideal ego is in the mirror stage essay is the fragmented body. It's the identification with one's body for the first time. And so the only thing that's being determined as far as the form is the fixed identification we have on our body, right? to some extent, we always identify with our body, even if our ego ideal has a hard time maintaining the anticipation and the duties and responsibilities that come with a certain semiotic, you know, of the ego ideal. And so, like, being a teacher, being, you know, fulfilling
Placement.
the placement, like fulfilling the, you know, the duties and sort of norms and values that were bestowed on you by your parents. Or maybe, let's say, like, you didn't like your parents' is like norms and values, so you, like, of course the Oedipal rivalry is you rebel, but then you still find a sort of way to place yourself in the ego ideal level, you know, in sort of sense castration with maybe like your favorite teacher at high school, and then you kind of like look back at that, it's like, oh, they were like a father figure to me, or like they were like a mother figure to me, or like, you know, anybody else, you know, even if it's not your actual family, it's that, but you still fulfill these roles that are extensions of your of the body, or in the symbolic order, right? And what's interesting, if you think about it, is like, so, you know, prior to Descartes, there wasn't really any notion of the ego in the sense that we think now, or like before the Enlightenment, like we didn't have this, like in philosophy, there wasn't this notion of like the ego or like identity and like the way we think it now. Pretty much everything is the effect of Descartes. But like there is talk about the soul, but that's different, right? And it was always in relation to God. But the ego has this sort of, in philosophy, and even something that Freud is getting at, like, so for philosophy, it's like the ego has this sort of autonomy of thinking, of reason, and it is only through the conditions of bourgeois philosophy and bourgeois society that the ego is realized, of course, in the misrecognized form of its freedom. Because it's like with the whole revolutions that happen for a bourgeois society, it's like a bunch of intellectuals that are just like, we desire freedom because man deserves to be free. We need no God or anything like that, or like kings to rule or monarchs. It's like we are self-serving. We need a social contract, or we just need a democracy of checks and balances. Regardless, what this amounts to bring about is the effect of bourgeois societies in which it's laissez-faire, my relation to private property. It's not that I need to identify with my freedom of my image of my body, but in what I do and perform as a bourgeois individual, the property that I own, you know, the businesses that I do, the transactions. These are conditions that allow ego and ego ideal ego and ego ideal to exist not only conceptually but also as pathologies. And so yes, psychoanalysis in a sense is a bourgeois science, but only insofar as that it realizes, as Freud did according to Rose Ichner, the limits and failures of bourgeois society, right? That these things, these notions, and the way that we look at ourselves are the result of the symptom. And so what Freud is looking at is the limits and failures of both the ideal ego and then the ego ideal, because there's something more that's going on that in this failure, this insistence. We got the super ego, right? This cruel and thing from a categorical imperative sense. And this is the whole point about kind of exod and enjoyment for Lacan, but also of death drive, which is something that destroys our pleasure principle, that what we want is not our own, you know, pleasure, but our own enjoyment, which is cruel and undermining. But that really the whole thing of capitalism and bourgeois ideology is that it is a misrecognition of one's own ideology, right? It's not a false consciousness in the way that Marx thought, because that has to do with ideas. And yes, ideas do, in a sense, play in, but false consciousness is not on the level of having bad ideas versus good ideas. It's on the matter of misrecognizing yourself in, you know, what you relate to and in how you participate, right? In these
Mm,
identifications, and that's with your own private property and how you reflect back onto yourself.
that's really good.
Yeah.
I don't know if I can top that. That nice,
Yeah.
nice.
Should we
All
quote it
right.
right there?
No, well, I wanted to say one more thing though, as like, because I don't want to say one more thing. I want us to just do one more thing for
Yeah.
uh our listeners. The few of them that there are, in an
Yeah.
ideal world, we'd have more because we're
Yeah. We're popping in
actually
the UK apparently.
shout out to our UK bruvs.
Yeah.
Shout out to our Indian brethren and
Yeah.
brethren. It's not a word, but shout out to anyone who listens to us. The 6 ladies that listen to us and all the bros. But what about, let's just try to pitch seminar 2 for people. Why read seminar 2? Like, here's the thing.
Yeah.
Look, I know that I want to understand Zizek. He's a madman. He's a philosopher of our time. I want to know what the fuck he's talking about. I'm in the minority. I take him seriously. I know this whole Lacanian business. There's something going on, but I want to understand Zizek. I want to be able to explain what he's saying. So I'm gonna breeze through a few seminars, the big ones, 7, 11, 20, 23, and then I'll done, and then maybe it's like I'll feel like, okay, I did the work that I needed to do in Lacan, and then I can kind of leave Lacan aside because everything he's sublated in Zizek, right? So that's all I need to know. I'll read a little bit of Zizek, and then it's like I'm Gucci. But obviously, we're taking a different approach. We feel that ideally, not that we'll have the time, but Lacan's entire oeuvre should be digested. And that we love Zizek, but maybe to really understand Zizek is to tarry with Lacan.
Yeah.
So, like, why read seminars? Well, let's not just limit it to 2. First, like, why read 2, and then why read the first 3? Because we are also
Yeah.
we have to admit that we're also cutting corners because we don't have all the time in the world, and we will skip to 7 after 3. Not that 4, 5, and 6 don't have any importance, but like, yeah, we're also Lacanizing to use on things, and hope to go back to those other seminars eventually. But the whole point is like, yeah, why read these 3 seminars? Why read 2 in particular?
Yeah, that's a good question. So like, I think that, like, honestly, 1 and 2 complement each other, but if I had to like segregate them for viewers and people that are interested in Lacan, and I think it's the fact that, well, 1 could be a little too alienating to most people that are coming into it from a theory philosophy perspective, because it's not philosophy. He's talking to clinicians, and of course in this one he's talking to clinicians too, but the difference is that in this one there's more like philosophical gems in this one, I would argue, than compared to the first one, which is very more clinical because it's based on the metapsychology papers of Freud's papers on technique. But 2 is really, really rich, not just in the fact that we get the symbolic order in Lacan, but that I think of it as more an apology for Freud, and on really getting at the greatest discovery of Freud, which is in his Copernican revolution, which is the death drive. And why I say this, because if you read Freud's Beyond the Pleasure Principle as it is, you could fall into the revisionism of other Freudians or dismiss it like other Freudians and ego psychologists and Fairbairn bros, in which they just want to negate libido and death drive and just talk about object, or just think that he's biologized and everything. It's like, no. Well, Lacan points out in his reading of Beyond the Pleasure Principle and how you could trace this thought within each different seminal text of Freud, is that this thought was always in the process. This concept was lurking around. It just wasn't realized until this text. But he gives you a good reading of it, and he wants to talk about, it's like, well, Freud at this point is not doing biology. If anything, he's using certain anatomical terms as a sort of topography, right? As like a way to get at the heart of something, and also appropriating thermodynamics and energy for understanding the death instinct. And also just to show that, well, the ego is not just misrecognition, like in Seminar 1, it's also that due to the Copernican revolution, it is not the master of his own house, that the ego is an other, right? And that's what he gets at in here. So right here, a Seminar 2 gives you a more theoretical approach that could be more appealing to newer audiences and people that are more philosophically inclined and come to Lacan from Zizek, right? And but the early seminars together, 1 and 2, I think if you are really trying to be a diehard Lacanian scholar or really down for Lacan, I say read both of them. But if you're just kind of curious and want to get your feet wet, I think Seminar 2, because it is a defense of Freud, and I think that's the major key. Because if I would recommend any other seminar, which some people would say 7 or 11, which, yeah, but you don't really get the, okay, why Freud though? Right? And that's what I think is important to have before going into like the most popular ones, like 7, which you get in, which is used in more philosophical schools, or 11, like with Zizek. And the early seminars, like we've been reiterating, are not like Lacan talking about jouissance. He's not saying, he's not talking about objet. He's not like really talking about like the real that much, although like in this instance we get certain sections of Seminar 2 where it's mentioned. He will say desire is the desire of the other, but it's not like formulated like in Seminar 5, right? So what we get is more of like an emphasis of Freud, and you get an understanding also of how Lacan works, like how he rambles on and it seems like he's not getting to any point. Why does he talk like this? Well, he's talking to clinicians. So you see how he is making himself to be the analysan, to be hystericized about like his understanding of Freud and his relationship to Freud.
Yeah, I love all that, and I don't have much to add other than that. Like, yeah, this is his return to Freud, and I think that, like, let's say for seasoned Lacanians who are mostly focused on their choice seminars, whether they're the big ones or one that's like neglected, this stuff feels like we're dealing with an immature Lacan, one that hasn't really come into his own.
Mm-hmm.
And no, he hasn't. But at least in terms of retroactivity, it's very interesting to kind of toy around with some of the mature, quote unquote, mature Lacan's central ideas, but in the context of what seems to be, in an overly modest key, a return to Freud without both the expediency nor the convenience and recourse to the lexicon he usually has.
Yeah.
In the sense that you're also in some way relieved of the baggage that comes with Oedipus, name of a father, everything else. But it can also be more tedious to see him work through these ideas without signifier, signified, and all these central concepts. But I think at least just, I don't know, as an exercise, it's good to return to these seminars because you get some really interesting views on Lacan, nascent Lacan, trying to figure shit out, but also hitting on something. And I feel to my dying day, stand behind recreational mathematics and the Purloined Letter and the Prisoner's Dilemma. If we're gonna salvage anything from that can't necessarily be easily spun into, well, the concept of dusting or object A does it better. I think that recreational mathematics, Purloined Letter, Prisoner's Dilemma, I think all of those home in on something that I don't know Lacan's entire work, his corpus, well enough to say whether it does or doesn't, but seems to be a kind of one-off, but a very important one that is worth returning to if we are to understand what we mean by the symbolic order, insistence, and it's the connection between the imaginary and the symbolic. Because to me, that the connection between the imaginary and the symbolic, that's a relationship that is woefully underemphasized, and it should be emphasized. And I think in these two seminars, we really get a feel for them, and it's really worth working through that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the last thing I want to say is shout out to Mr. X and Leclerc,
Valabrega,
the little idolater. There's a lot of quotables in these seminars too.
Yeah,
right?
that's good. Yeah, especially seminar 2.
He straight up like sons Leclerc at one point. He's like, "Don't be soft." You know?
Yeah, don't be. Yeah, he says, "Don't be soft."
But damn, way to be a toxically masculine over here. Telling people not to be soft.
He said, "Don't be happy-go-lucky."
But remember, though, if you want to learn anything from the first 2 seminars, I would say he says in one phrase: "Don't get too excited."
Yeah, the fun is over.
The fun is over, motherfuckers. All right, we're gonna quilt it there. That's it. Let me see if I can figure out how to.
Yeah.
Stop recording on here.
Yeah, you're on your phone.
All right.